Welcome to the ScottMadden Energy Exchange, conversations with leaders shaping the future of the energy industry. I'm your host, Mark Miller, partner and energy practice leader at ScottMadden. In this podcast, we explore the most important issues facing utilities and energy companies, from infrastructure and regulation to operations and strategy. We focus not just on what's changing, but on what it takes to execute in a complex and evolving environment. Today's episode is titled Capital Allocation, Building to Serve a High-Growth Energy System. Utilities are entering a new capital cycle. Across the industry, we're seeing more than $1 trillion of planned investment driven by load growth, resilience needs, aging infrastructure, and the energy transition. But this isn't just about investing more. Utilities are being asked to deploy capital more deliberately and more effectively than ever before. So this creates a dual challenge. Are we investing in the right things? And can we actually deliver them? Getting one right without the other doesn't create value, and increasingly, both are under scrutiny. To explore that, I'm joined by Gerardo Morales and Tony Gonzalez, partners at ScottMadden who work closely with utilities on capital allocation and execution. Welcome, Gerardo and Tony. We're hearing a lot about the scale of investment across the industry. How would you describe the capital cycle utilities are entering right now?
Well, thank you, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity. Very excited to join the conversation here today. And I think it's fair to say that we're entering one of the most significant investment cycles the utility industry has seen in decades. So as part of some of the research that we recently completed, we analyzed capital plans of the largest electric utilities in the country. And by just looking at the publicly announced plans, we found that more than 1.2 trillion in planned capital investments over the next several years. And what's interesting is that this number already exceeds many of the industry-wide estimates that are commonly referenced. But what makes this cycle unique, it isn't about the amount of money being invested. It's basically the number of forces that are converging at the same time. Utilities are responding to large load growth, particularly from data centers and new industrial customers. I think we've all heard the news and seen all the different headlines. But at the same time, they're also responding to modernizing an aging infrastructure, strengthening the grid for a more resilient response, especially after extreme weather events. They're also integrating new generation resources, supporting electrification, and meeting evolving regulatory expectations. And all of these are converging and being investment drivers on their own and happening simultaneously. And I think that's important distinction because sometimes the conversation becomes this is all about data centers. And data centers are certainly an important driver, but they're only one piece of a much broader story. And to me, that's what makes this period so different. Utilities aren't simply building infrastructure, they're being asked to transform the grid while continuing to deliver safe, reliable, and affordable service.
So that's a tremendous amount of investment. And, you described a lot of the factors at play. Maybe a little more color on what makes this cycle different from previous periods of investment.
Well, Mark, I'll jump in on that one. Great to be here. To your question, I think two things stand out. First, all of these investment drivers are happening at the same time. In the past, utilities might have gone through a very focused period on environmental compliance, generation expansion, or improvement on the transmission grid. Today, they're managing all those at the same time. And while dealing with load growth, digital modernization, great expectations for resiliency, I should say, that's a level of complexity that we've not seen in a very long time, or quite frankly, maybe never before. The second big difference is probably the bigger one of the two, is that utilities aren't just capital constrained anymore. They're becoming more execution constrained. Getting the funding approved is just one part of the equation. you still have to engineer those projects. You still have to buy critical equipment. You still have to secure permitting. You got to get those outages. You got to line up contractors, and you got to do this work all safely. Each one of those steps is competing for the same limited resources. We're seeing that across the industry. Lead times for critical or key equipment is getting longer. Skilled labor is very tight. Contractors in some regions or jurisdictions are booked for years out. And inside the utilities, many of the same teams built the same way are being asked to handle a much larger volume of work than they ever did before. So I think the conversation is starting to shift. Like a few years ago, the big question was, do we have the financing? Can we actually pay for this project? Now it's more, can we actually deliver on it? Which are two very different things.
So let's take a look at that from a little bit of a different angle. That's a great point, Tony. Utilities are being asked, or they're required to invest more today, but they're also, it seems, being required to be more disciplined in how they do it. So, let's start with the first part of that challenge. Are we investing in the right things? How do utilities today prioritize their capital investment?
Well, Mark, I think utilities traditionally have done a pretty good job in prioritizing capital investments. I mean, this is not a new discipline. It's been around for years, especially mature organizations. They have decades of experience evaluating projects based on safety, reliability, regulatory compliance, customer growth, even some financial considerations. So it's not a new discipline. It's certainly not a new process. So the challenge isn't that utilities aren't prioritizing, is that the environment that they're operating is become more complicated and more sophisticated. And what we've seen across the industry is that a number of competing priorities has grown significantly. You might have a utility proposing a project to improve reliability, serve a new load for a data center, replace aging infrastructure. You can go down the list of the different types and different investments required to modernize the grid. And every one of those has a legitimate business case, and every one of those has stakeholders advocating for it. And that's where prioritization is becoming more difficult. So the question is no longer, is this a good project? The question becomes, is this the best use of limited capital compared to everything else that we're doing? And one thing that we have observed is that many organizations still make decisions primarily within the individual business units. So for example, generation will look at the portfolio generation projects, transmission will look at the transmission projects, distribution will do the same, and so forth. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But as capital programs continue to grow, utilities are increasingly asking whether they should be looking across the entire portfolio to optimize investment at the enterprise level. And that's really where we see the industry heading.
And increasingly, the system has to be planned in a way that integrates across those value streams. GT Andy will have a podcast on that later in the season. One of the tensions here that there's a lot of conversation about is that, many utilities, of course, earn returns on invested capital, but at the same time, there's increasing scrutiny on affordability and customer value. How is that changing the way utilities need to think about their allocation of capital?
I think that's a great question because it really gets to the heart of how the industry is evolving. Utilities has always operated within a regulatory framework that is basically designed to encourage long-term investment in infrastructure. And that model has served well the industry over, and not only the industry, but customers well over decades. But what's changing is not the regulatory model itself. What's changing is really the environment around it. We now have a situation where customers could potentially face higher energy bills. And the different regulatory jurisdictions are now seeing some of the largest capital plans they've seen over decades. And the expectation is pretty much the same. Utilities are still being asked to modernize the grid and replace the aging infrastructure, maintain reliability, support economic growth initiatives, And they're expected to achieve all of that while maintaining affordable rates for their customers. So naturally, the question becomes, how do we know that these investments are actually creating the greatest value for the customers that they serve? One example to illustrate this point is around the data center boom that the industry is currently experiencing. And as we have gone through this phase, the natural question, or what a lot of the jurisdictions have been asking, is who should be paying for all the infrastructure needed to serve these data centers? And what we're seeing is that a lot of utilities are, proposing new large load tariffs or other types of mechanisms that in essence will shift some of that financial risk from their customers to maybe the developers or whoever is proposing the project. And this is just a simple illustration just to uh, provide a sense of the level of scrutiny that a lot of these investments decisions are now undertaking. So in summary, to us, it's not simply enough to identify what is the infrastructure that is needed. Now the norm is going to be that all utilities and the different stakeholders involved will need to demonstrate, who benefits from the investment, who should bear the cost, and it's cleanly explain why this is the best approach and why is this fair for the customers that they serve.
Those are great points, Gerardo. Tony, when you think about good prioritization of capital, what does that actually look like in practice within an organization?
Yeah, I think it starts with recognizing that prioritization really isn't about ranking these projects. It's about making hard choices, or to use that word Gerardo just used, the trade-offs. Most utilities have more good projects than they have capital, people, or even time to execute them. The goal isn't to identify every good project. It's really about deciding which mix of projects creates the most value for the customers and the grid within the limits you have as a utility. The utilities that do this well, they tend to think in terms of portfolios, not just one project at a time. Instead of only asking, is this a good project? They ask, how does this compare to everything else we're doing? That changes the discussion a bit. When Gerardo and I were both at a utility, safety and regulatory compliance always came first. That hasn't changed. But after that, they're balancing reliability, customer growth, resiliency, affordability, as Gerardo just mentioned, risk reduction. And can we actually realistically deliver this portfolio is one that they have to continue to ask. It's not just one factor decision. It's about understanding how those competing priorities fit together across their entire portfolio. The other thing is we see more is discipline around using consistent evaluation criteria. That doesn't mean every decision is made with a formula, a perfect equation. It's really about, it also incorporates the judgment of leadership, but it's about a clear, repeatable process that helps everyone understand why decisions are being made. At the end of the day, good prioritization isn't about finding the perfect project. It's about making the best decision you can with the information and resources you have available.
So I've heard you say many times in conversation, it's no longer enough to justify a project. You have to show it's the best option as well, in addition to those other considerations you mentioned. Are utilities that we work with fully considering the alternatives like non-wires solutions or grid enhancing technologies, or do we see traditional approaches still dominating?
I think that's a great question, Mark. And I think it's fair to say that there's been some progress in this area, but there's opportunity for improvement. And typically, the way we view this is that historically, utility planning processes have been built around some of the traditional investments. For example, if you identify a constraint in the system, the solution was often, do we need a new transmission line? Do we need a new substation? Or just another conventional capital project? And the challenge is that those solutions are well understood and they've been used for decades. And the processes in place have these solutions embedded within them. But what's changing, at least in our opinion, is that regulators and stakeholders are increasingly asking utilities to demonstrate what other alternatives are you evaluating before making these investments. So it's no longer enough to identify the need. There's also a growing expectation that utilities will also demonstrate what other options they consider. So, for example, in the state of Georgia, as part of their integrated resource plan process, the Public Service Commission actually directed Georgia Power to formally evaluate grid enhancing technologies, or GETs, as some of us know it, for some of their major transmission projects. And the interesting part is that this isn't about the technology itself, is that the utility needs to now demonstrate a structured, transparent, and repeatable process for determining when GETs should be considered, or how should those technologies be evaluated against traditional solutions. And I think this is a broader trend that we're seeing across the industry, Mark. So whether it's GETs, non-wires alternative, demand response programs, advanced conductors, the expectation is becoming less about promoting a specific technology and more about having a disciplined framework for evaluating the different solutions. So at the end of the day, it's not about proving what innovative technologies are always the answer. Sometimes we know that the traditional solutions are the best options. But the important thing is that having a transparent process that evaluates these alternatives consistently, that documents the trade-offs, and gives regulators and stakeholders the confidence that you selected the investment that is going to deliver the most value for the customers that they serve.
Those are great points, Gerardo, and really good insights across the clients we work with. And I know even if clients get the planning and prioritization right, there's another challenge that you alluded to earlier that's becoming increasingly important. Let's talk about execution, actually executing the capital plan and putting steel in the ground, as we say. What are the biggest constraints utilities are facing when it comes to delivering these new and larger capital programs?
Well, Mark, the biggest constraint today is capacity across the organization. A few years ago, most conversations were about access to capital. Today, many utilities have the capital. The harder question is whether they have the ability to actually get the work done. And when I say capital, I don't just mean headcount like engineering resources, project managers, supply chain and finance support, and even their contractors. But I also mean the processes, the data, and the systems to help manage permitting, outage coordination, and project tracking at a very high level of work. We're seeing the same teams being asked to deliver capital programs that are much larger than what they were designed to build and support. At the same time, they're competing with other utilities, developers, and industrial customers for the same resources. Supply chain is still a major challenge too. Lead times for critical equipment are much longer than they were a few years ago. And in some cases, utilities have to make procurement decisions years before the construction even starts. That means planning, engineering, procurement, and construction have to be much more connected than they were in the past. A delay in one area can quickly escalate and create a delay in an entire capital program. So the issue isn't that utilities don't have what they need to build or they don't have the cash to build it. It's that delivering on those investments is getting harder.
So the industry isn't just capital constrained, it's execution constrained in all those areas you mentioned. In your work with clients, how often are you seeing well-justified and approved capital plans run into challenges in execution?
Well, I would say I think it happens more often than people might expect. And the interesting piece on that, Mark, is that the challenges are not really the capital plans themselves. We typically observe a lot of organizations have strong planning processes, as mentioned earlier. They know how to identify the need, justify the investment, and actually put the plan together. So the challenges tend to emerge as those plans actually move through the organization. And one thing that we have observed, Mark, as we work with different utilities, is that one recurring theme or topic or challenge, if you will, is that every function is trying to do the right thing. And they're often optimizing for their own internal processes within the capital lifecycle framework. So, for example, planning is trying to identify the right projects, engineering is focused on the design of projects, supply chain and procurement, and so forth. You can go down to construction, operations, and finance. So, the challenge is not whether we're performing those functions very well, it's really around the handoffs and having the proper visibility and consistency across data throughout the life cycle that would enable the leaders in the organization to understand the downstream impacts of decisions being made and how projects move from one phase to the next. And I think we're also seeing a lot of utilities putting an extra lens and focus on execution readiness, especially much earlier in the planning process. So they're asking questions like, do we actually have the organizational capacity to deliver on this project? You heard Tony talking about this in one of the earlier questions. Are the right functions aligned? Do we need to look at uh, deploying different organizational changes to better align with the capital plans and the scale and complexity of the projects? And then, of course, can we realistically execute on the schedule? So to me, we're seeing an evolution. It's not treating capital planning and execution as separate activities, and it's really thinking about both of them as one holistic activity that is driving the different investment decisions being made by the different stakeholders.
Thanks, Gerardo. It sounds like that disconnect, if you want to call it that, between planning and execution shows up in a few ways inside utilities. Tony, what are the most common issues you're seeing inside utilities as they try to manage growing capital programs?
Yeah, Mark, I'd say one of the biggest themes is fragmentation. Most utilities have good people, good processes, solid tools inside each of the business units. Planning has great tools, engineering has a set of tools, supply chain and finance has theirs. The issue is that those groups and organizations don't always work from the same picture or the same sheet of music. That used to work when Gerardo was managing generation projects or when I was managing T&D projects. However, as capital continues to grow today, those disconnects become glaring and very easy to see. For example, different groups may be managing or maintaining different versions of project information. Leadership meetings then can turn into reconciling data, or instead of making important decisions. Teams spend a lot of time and effort building reports manually because information isn't moving clearly from one group to the next. We've also seen situations where one group changes a schedule or a scope, but it doesn't trickle down quickly to the next group, like procurement or construction. Everyone is doing the best they can, but they aren't always working from the same facts. That makes organizations more reactive. Instead of managing a portfolio ahead of time, they're responding to the latest issue, revising schedules after a problem emerges, escalating risks too late, or explaining why my project moved. As these capital programs continue to grow, that approach becomes harder to maintain. That's why utilities are focusing more on less on adding tools and more on improving integration and governance and better portfolio visibility. The goal really is about creating a trusted view of capital programs and their projects so leaders can make better decisions before small issues become large issues.
Tony, when you look at the process through an organization and across functions, where do things tend to break down most often in those coordination items and handoffs?
I think it's natural to point to one function, like planning, engineering, procurement, or construction operations. But that's not usually where the problem starts. Projects usually break down on those handoffs between those various organizations. Planning may identify the right project, but engineering may have a slightly different set of assumptions about the scope. Procurement may see equipment constraints, but it didn't happen earlier in the process for the project. Construction may find issues in the field. Operations may have outage needs that weren't fully built into the plan. None of those groups are necessarily doing anything wrong. The problem is that decisions aren't always made with the same information in mind. As programs get larger, those small disconnects can compound pretty quickly. Schedule slip, procurement has to adjust, construction misses outage windows, costs ultimately go up. Before long, leaders are managing the downstream impact instead of the actual issue that caused it. That's why integrated governance matters, Mark. It's not about creating more meetings or bureaucracy. It's about getting the right people together at the right time to make key decisions so issues can be handled before they ripple across the organization. To me, the big opportunity most organizations don't have one single functional problem. They have an integration problem.
Tony, and that really points to a broader issue around how capital is managed across the full life cycle. Gerardo, how should utilities be thinking about capital, not just as a planning exercise, but as a full life cycle from planning through execution?
Well, I think everything we've talked about up to this point really points to one conclusion, Mark. And it's really that utilities need to stop thinking about capital as a series of individual projects and really start thinking about an integrated delivery system, if you will. So the way I view this is instead of asking, do we have a good capital plan? Maybe we should be asking, do we have a system that can consistently turn that plan into a successful outcome or successful outcomes? And to me, that's a real shift in mindset. Success is not solely determined by selecting the right projects. It's about connecting planning, engineering, procurement, construction, so all the different organizations so that the entire organization is working towards the same outcome. At the end of the day, we think that ultimately utilities are not going to be judged by the quality of the plans that they file. They're really going to be judged whether they are able to execute on that plan and whether they deliver the successful outcomes that they committed to deliver.
So utilities need to think about capital as an integrated enterprise lifecycle, planning, prioritization, governance, engineering, all the way through operational integration after commissioning. Where do you see the biggest disconnects between all those phases today? Do planning decisions always reflect execution reality, or are most utilities, as you alluded to earlier, still optimizing pieces of the system, but not the system as a whole?
From my view, most utilities have good, if not great, individual pieces. The question is whether those pieces fit together well enough to scale. Many utilities are planning to invest 2 or even 3 times what they deployed just a decade ago. That raises a significant and different set of questions. For example, is the planning process repeatable, or does it rely on manual work every budget cycle? Do leaders have reliable data to make portfolio decisions? Are teams working on the same information? Are workflows standardized, or are people still relying on spreadsheets, emails, and online conversations to keep the project moving? These are all things I did as a project manager 10 years ago. Those questions matter because as capital programs grow, manual processes don't just become less efficient, they become a source of risk. We're seeing utilities step back and ask whether their operating model is really designed for the level of investment they're planning over the next 5 to 10 years. Put simply, can the system scale? To me, that's where the conversation is headed, and it really needs to. It's not just about improving individual functions, it's about building a delivery model with standardized processes, connected data, structure, and governance that can handle bigger and more complex capital programs year after year. Structure, staffing, reporting, tools, and decision-making worked for the utility delivering at a certain level and lower capital. They didn't work so well when the number doubled in a short period of time. That's an important distinction. Getting approval for larger capital plans is a major and a very important milestone, but it's not the finish line. You still have to ask whether the organization is prepared to execute at that scale. In many ways, that's becoming the bigger question for the industry. It's not finding the capital or developing the plan. It's building an organization that could put the capital to work safely, efficiently, and in a way that delivers the outcomes that the utility promised.
So utilities really need to manage capital differently than they have in the past. But what does that actually look like in practice? What differentiates utilities that are doing this well from those that are struggling?
Well, Mark, I think in our experience, we can summarize those in three things. And a lot of these are related to some of the topics we've already covered in our discussion today. The first one is really looking at this at the enterprise level. So we talked a little bit earlier around optimizing within the individual functions, whether it's generation, transmission, distribution. And we're really starting to see a shift with more mature organizations that are taking a closer look at the enterprise level and ultimately thinking through, is this the best project not only for the organization, for the customers? And that's easier said than done, especially when there's trade-offs and executives that lead each of those functions and how the right processes are in place to enable that enterprise level review and prioritization exercise. The second is, I think, we're seeing a lot of utilities investing in their systems and data. And you heard Tony talk about the different fragmentation. And this is an area that we're seeing consistent investment in really improving how, if you're managing a multi-billion-dollar capital portfolio, you can't really afford each group working from a different data sets. So what we're seeing is some significant investments in that area to really improve data quality and the connections between the different systems across the different processes. And the third one is what Tony covered in our last question, is really looking at, are we built to scale? Are they repeatable? Are they standardized? Are they digitized enough that will enable the growth that we need to successfully deliver on these capital plans? So those three things are what we're observing. And it's a shift from what we're seeing more mature organizations evolve, especially after they take on more complicated and sophisticated capital plans.
Thanks, Gerardo. Tony, related to that, what role do we see true organizational alignment playing in making all this work?
Mark, that's one of my favorite topics. And here it's about leadership. Leadership matters a lot. Today's capital programs require that all groups involved in capital delivery move in the same direction. That doesn't happen by accident. It's basically driven by the leaders. Over the years, one of my favorite leaders did this very well. She set common priorities, clarified decision rights, made sure everybody understood how their decisions affected the rest of the organization. Leaders that do that today will get people aligned more often than not. I will say today's leaders are asking different questions than they did a few years ago. It used to be, did we deliver this project on time and on budget? Now it's, are we prepared to keep delivering at this level year after year after year, project after project? That's an important shift because it's not just about one project's performance. It's about the organization's ability to keep up with that portfolio. To me, and that leader I just talked about, alignment means getting people out of their lanes enough to understand how their decisions affect each other. Everyone still has an important role to play, but we all need to be working toward the same goals.
Thank you, Tony. Gerardo, some practical advice for utilities that may be earlier in this journey. Where should they start? Do they pilot certain capabilities before scaling them? What are practical steps you could offer?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, Mark, is that I would resist the temptation to transform everything at once. And from our point of view, really the first step is to kind of really taking a step back and understanding where your current challenges and bottlenecks reside today. And we think that's a very obviously important step because there's a natural tendency to really think through the complexity and the scale of these capital plans and whether we need to completely transform the organization to adjust to that. And that might not be the case. In our view, before you start redesigning an entire process or deploying a new system or technology, really having a clear understanding of the challenges and bottlenecks is an adequate first step. From there, there's a couple other steps that we would encourage utilities and the different stakeholders to take. And one is to really identify what are some of those high impact areas. And that doesn't mean that you don't have a roadmap that's going to take you to where you think you're going to be a leading practice organization. But what we advocate is that you select some of those high impact areas that's going to help you and allow you to build some momentum. And these could be things as typically focus on whether do we have a repeatable process? Do we have a lot of manual workarounds that we need to solve for and maybe deploy new tools, systems, technologies? Or do we have the right visibility on the portfolio? So we've seen a lot of evidence in the industry where that becomes a challenge, and especially as the portfolios grow in number of scale and projects, that could be an area to focus. But the idea is to start with some high impact areas and then really move into a continuous improvement organizational capability where we're continuously refining those processes and continuously evolving and thinking through how do we improve our data quality, how do we improve the integration of the different organizations involved to really move up in the maturity curve and deliver the results that we expect. So at the end of the day, it's really starting with some high impact areas, putting some continuous improvement mentality, and building the organizational capacity or capability, if you will, that will deliver the results that we expect from the capital plans.
Thanks, Gerardo. And Tony, let's make this more concrete before we kind of close out the discussion today. Can you share an example of a utility that needed to significantly scale its capital program as we've discussed, and what ultimately determined whether they were successful in going down that path? It strikes me that there is funding. Do we have access to the capital we need? And then there's organizational readiness, and they're not the same.
You're right. And as we mentioned before, the lesson here is that access to capital and readiness to use that capital are two very different things. We've worked with utilities that had great regulatory support, access to financing, and capital plans. On paper, that looks great. But when the spending started to ramp up, the organization had trouble keeping pace. The issue wasn't the funding, the plan. It was that many of the underlying capabilities for the organization had been built for a much smaller and dated program. The structure, staffing, reporting, tools, and decision-making worked when the utility was delivering on a certain level and lower level of capital. They didn't work so well when the number doubled in a short period of time. That's an important distinction. Getting approval for the capital plan is a major and important milestone, but it's not the finish line. You still have to ask the question, is the organization prepared to execute at that scale? In many ways, it's becoming the bigger question for the industry. It's not just finding the capital or developing the plan. It's building an organization that can put the capital to work safely, efficiently, in a way that delivers on the outcomes that the utility promised.
Thanks, Tony. Great points. Gerardo, looking ahead, what do you think will differentiate the leading utilities as this capital cycle continues?
I actually think the conversation is going to shift from how much utilities are investing to how effectively they're investing. And I think if you look over the past several years, Mark, I think everyone's been focused on just the sheer size of these capital plans. And there certainly have been unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like this in several decades. But we fully expect this to be the new normal, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. So really the question becomes, what did we get? What did we get for all this investment? Did reliability improve? The interconnection timelines improve? How was affordability impacted by all of this? So in our view, success won't really be measured by the size of the capital plan. It will be measured by the value those investments ultimately deliver. The utilities that separate themselves won't necessarily be the ones that are spending the most. They'll be the ones that we think are going to consistently demonstrate that the outcomes their investment created actually deliver good value for their customers.
Thanks, Gerardo. Tony, let's close it out with kind of a forward-looking, practical next step. If you were advising utility executives today, what's the one thing they should do differently when it comes to capital allocation and execution?
If I could leave utility executives with one thought, I think it would be spend as much time asking whether the organization can deliver that capital plan as you did deciding on what's in that capital plan. Most of us spend a lot of time debating which projects should be funded, and that's important. The other question is just as important. Can we deliver and execute on this plan as we committed to? That means looking beyond the project list. It means things like, do we have the right oversight? Do we have the right talent? Are our process scalable? Do our leaders have visibility to make decisions? Are we building an organization that's ready not just for this year, but for the decade to come? The utilities that ask those questions early will be in a much better position to deliver on those commitments to the customers, the regulators, and their boards. At the end of the day, a capital plan is just a list of projects. They're very important projects, but it's also a commitment. The organizations that keep those commitments are the ones that will earn trust over time.
Great stuff. Thank you. Gerardo, Tony, thanks for joining the podcast today. Really appreciate you sharing your perspective on how utilities can better align capital planning and execution to be successful in the future.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the ScottMadden Energy Exchange. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find individual contact information in the show notes or reach us at info@scottmadden.com.